An infrared camera at Skinwalker Ranch sat silently in the freezing Utah darkness, logging the quiet. For 30 years, every billionaire, Pentagon official, and physicist who investigated the Uinta Basin made the exact same fatal mistake. They built fences, aimed their equipment inward, and assumed the most terrifying intelligence on Earth was trapped inside with them. They were wrong. The anomaly wasn't born on the property. It has been traveling there. And at 2:17 a.m., a perimeter sensor finally caught it arriving. Nestled deep within the Uinta Basin of northeastern Utah lies a stretch of Earth that simply does not behave the way land should. This is a landscape of jagged red rock ridges, sparse brush, and a crushing, isolated silence. But the silence here is not empty. It is heavy. It is expectant. Skinwalker Ranch is an epicenter of the unexplained, permeated by an invisible dread that defies all conventional description. In the traditional world of paranormal investigation, researchers set up their instruments, power on their cameras, and wait in the quiet dark. They hope to catch a fleeting glimpse of something just beyond the veil. Sometimes the shadows move, but usually they do not. The standard model of anomalous research relies on the assumption that the phenomenon is passive, a residual echo of trauma or a localized tear in reality that occasionally bleeds through. But this property is entirely different. It is not an empty stage waiting for an apparition to wander out from the wings. It is an active, waking, breathing presence, and it seems to look right back at whoever is watching. For decades, those who have walked this 512-acre parcel of soil have felt its gaze. This is not the creeping paranoia of an overactive imagination. It is a physical sensation, a pressure drop in the atmosphere that precedes impossible events. In the early 1990s, Terry and Gwen Sherman thought they had found a remote little paradise to raise their children. They purchased the land, moved their prized cattle onto the pastures, and tried to build a life. But almost immediately, the land began to reject them. The Shermans found their cattle dead under impossible circumstances. These were not the messy, chaotic kills of a mountain lion or a pack of coyotes. The animals were found mutilated with a cold, surgical precision. Eyes, tongues, and reproductive organs were removed cleanly, with cuts so precise they appeared cauterized. There was no blood on the ground. There were no tracks leading to the carcasses. No earthly predator or blade could ever replicate the absolute sterility of these kills. Terry Sherman was a hardened rancher who built fences with his bare hands. He was not a man prone to fantasy or delusion. Yet he spent the rest of his life recounting the horrors he witnessed on that land. He watched solid objects move effortlessly through locked doors. He saw unearthly lights trace impossible grid patterns across the night sky, violating every known principle of aerodynamics and physics. And despite facing intense public ridicule, no amount of skepticism ever altered his account by a single chilling detail. He knew exactly what he saw, and it terrified him enough to abandon his dream ranch just 18 months after moving in. The Shermans' desperate exit caught the attention of Las Vegas aerospace billionaire Robert Bigelow. In 1996, Bigelow purchased the property for $200,000 and immediately deployed a privately funded scientific task force. This was the National Institute for Discovery Science, or NIDS. Bigelow industrialized the hunt. He brought in veterinarians, biochemists like Dr. Colm Kelleher, and a small army of technicians to wire the property with round-the-clock surveillance. They set up command centers, deployed heavy instrumentation, and waited for the ranch to perform. And perform it did, but never on their terms. The intelligence operating at Skinwalker Ranch immediately demonstrated a mocking, adversarial awareness. Cameras would be dismantled from the inside out. Heavy cables would be cleanly sliced. The phenomenon always seemed to know exactly where the blind spots were, operating just outside the field of view, leaving behind only the physical aftermath of its presence. Following the NIDS era, the United States government quietly stepped into the basin. The Pentagon launched the Advanced Aerospace Weapons System Applications Program, or AAWSAP. This was a covert initiative, funded at a level that dwarfed anything private researchers could ever dream of deploying. They brought in military-grade sensors, classified methodologies, and personnel with top-secret clearances. They occupied the ranch and studied it with the cold, calculating eye of national security. And finally, in 2016, real estate developer Brandon Fugel purchased the land, initiating a new era of unrelenting, transparent scrutiny under the guidance of lead scientist Eric Bard and astrophysicist Dr. Travis Taylor. Across all these decades of relentless, well-funded study, from Bigelow to the Pentagon to Fugel, every single program ultimately uncovered the exact same terrifying truth. The ranch responds to observation. It actively tracks the deployment of instrumentation. It deliberately calibrates its output to match the sophistication of whoever happens to be watching. This is not a ghost story. This is an intelligence with total operational awareness. It knows when the cameras are turned on. It knows the spectrum of light the sensors are capturing. It knows where the scientists are standing, and it knows exactly what they're looking for. Recent investigations under the Fugel administration decided to stop looking at the sky and start looking at the dirt. They deployed ground-penetrating radar, heavy sonar imaging, and repeated aerial surveys to pierce the soil. What they found shattered all preconceived notions of the local geology. The property sits atop a vast, hidden network of underground voids and tunnel-like formations that defy all conventional explanation. These are massive structures that simply should not exist beneath the Uinta Basin. They are chambers mapped at depths that no natural erosion process, no subterranean aquifer, and no tectonic shifting could ever produce. They possess a geometry that suggests something far more deliberate than natural formation. For Dr. Travis Taylor, a scientist heavily grounded in physics and aerospace engineering, the subsurface data pointed to one inescapable, deeply unsettling conclusion. Whatever is manifesting above the ground at Skinwalker Ranch is inextricably linked to something operating deep beneath it. There are two distinct layers of activity, one location, and for the first time in history, the team finally had advanced instruments pointed at both the sky above and the bedrock below. But despite all the money, all the technology, and all the brilliant minds dedicated to solving this mystery, there was a fatal flaw in their geometry. For 30 unbroken years, every single investigation at Skinwalker Ranch made the exact same underlying assumption. They all believed that the source of the anomaly lived strictly inside the boundary line. They focused intensely on the mesa, the homestead triangle, and the aerial corridor directly above the pastures. Every sensor array, every camera grid, and every tactical deployment was oriented strictly inward. They stared intensely at the interior of the property, locking their gaze on the active zones that had already proven their capacity to generate anomalous, physics-defying data. That single, unquestioned assumption shaped absolutely everything. It dictated which scientific questions were asked, and it determined exactly where the cutting-edge technology was aimed. This assumption defined what the investigation was designed to look for, and, far more critically, what it was structurally incapable of seeing. Because everyone was looking inward, nobody ever looked outward. Not NIDS, not the Pentagon's highly classified AAWSAP initiative, not the years of broadcast investigation that followed. The ultimate blind spot in the history of Skinwalker Ranch was not a failure of resources. It was not a failure of methodology or a lack of advanced equipment. It was a failure of focus. It was a failure of framing. Every program assumed their prey was already trapped inside the fence, so they aimed their instruments inward, entirely unaware that whatever lingered just outside the boundary was quietly watching them do it. But the terrifying reality is that the government actually knew. Declassified AAWSAP documents, forced into the public record through Freedom of Information Act disclosures, contain a geographic assessment of the broader Uinta Basin that changes everything. Researchers armed with classified funding and top-tier access had mapped not just the ranch, but the surrounding terrain. They mapped the approaches, the hidden corridors, and the uncharted stretches of the basin that private, inward-looking investigations had never bothered to touch. Within those declassified files, one specific section of the map is entirely swallowed by thick, black redactions. These were not careless blanket classification sweeps. They were surgical, deliberate deletions of data. The surviving text bleeding around those blacked-out gaps is incredibly revealing. It does not use the language of geological surveying. It uses the cold, bureaucratic language of access restriction. Someone investigated that outer section of the basin. Someone deployed assets into the dark terrain beyond the fence. Someone documented exactly what they found out there in the freezing night. And someone with immense institutional power decided that knowledge was far too dangerous and would never be shared with anyone who came after them. The data was buried. The findings were locked away. And for 30 years, the world's brightest minds stood inside the ranch and stared inward, while something just beyond the fence waited patiently for them to turn around. The realization of this massive generational blind spot birthed the Perimeter Monitoring Program. Lead scientist Eric Bard is a man who deals strictly with data, logging every fluctuation and anomaly with rigorous precision. He identified a chilling pattern after cross-referencing years of sensor logs with the crew's daily deployment records. The phenomenon always concentrated its activity exactly when the team was looking at a specific spot. Equipment failures spiked in direct proximity to deployed instruments. Aerial anomalies manifested predominantly when researchers actively engaged the interior zones. Physical symptoms, sudden illnesses, and unexplained neurological effects in the crew clustered tightly around moments of direct contact with the Mesa and the Homestead Triangle. The correlation was far too consistent to be natural. The intelligence was tracking the investigation in real time. It knew their schedule. It monitored their movements. And if it knew exactly when they were watching, it also logically knew when they were blind. The Perimeter program was specifically designed to lay a trap in those very blind spots. The goal was to watch the silence when human eyes were absent. A formidable, unblinking array of technology was constructed along the outer property line. They installed military-grade infrared cameras capable of reading incredibly faint heat differentials in absolute pitch blackness, at distances exceeding 300 meters. These cameras stood sentry along the fence line. Acoustic arrays blanketed the boundary corners, listening across the entire audio spectrum. They recorded everything from high-frequency shrieks down to bone-rattling 1 Hz infrasound, frequencies so low that they register as a physical vibration in the chest rather than a sound in the ear. Electromagnetic stations anchored the perimeter, continuously logging the baseline field strength, searching for any sudden surges in energy. Finally, ground vibration sensors, calibrated to the exact impossible depths mapped by the earlier sonar surveys, listened intently for movement deep within the Earth. The trap was meticulously set. The system was powered on, and it ran for 4 unbroken months. It was continuous, entirely automated, and completely unattended by human personnel. It waited in the cold dark, quietly logging the ambient silence of the Utah desert. Month after month, it recorded the baseline mundane reality of the boundary line. And then came the night it caught something. The interior of the property was completely abandoned. There were no active investigation sessions running. There were no crew members on site. The ranch was physically empty, leaving just the automated perimeter sensors standing watch in the dead of night. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the electromagnetic monitoring station, situated on the eastern boundary, suddenly woke up. The initial elevation in the invisible magnetic field strength was not a violently dramatic spike. In a quick, ordinary review, it might have been dismissed as a minor instrument glitch and ignored entirely. But as the data continued to pour in, it became obvious this did not behave like any known glitch. The elevated field strength held dead steady. For 11 unbroken minutes, there was no sharp spike, no sudden collapse, and no gradual drift back to baseline. It was sustained, and it was deliberate. And then, the source of the magnetic anomaly began to move. The invisible field strength tracked smoothly across the eastern sensors in a deliberate stalking sequence. It triggered Station 1, then Station 2, and then Station 3. The progression perfectly mirrored a physical source creeping slowly along the outside of the ranch's perimeter. When the technical team later reviewed the time-stamped logs and calculated the exact pace of that movement, the control room fell into a long, suffocating silence. The phenomenon was not just a passing surge. It was escalating. At 2:19 a.m., exactly 2 full minutes before any camera caught a visual manifestation, the acoustic sensors triggered. They captured heavy infrasound frequencies cycling through a precise, repeating sequence. This was not random environmental noise. It was not the wind howling through the red rocks, and it was not tectonic settling. It was highly structured. The team's audio specialist, a veteran with decades of experience recording seismic zones and deep-water military installations, scoured the ranch's vast data archives for a match. He found absolutely nothing. Whatever this acoustic anomaly was, he concluded, possessed the rigid internal organization of an engineered signal. It was broadcasting in a deep, heavy register that the human body can physically feel as a crushing weight, but cannot consciously hear. 2 minutes later, at 2:21 a.m., the Earth itself responded. The ground vibration sensors registered heavy, sustained movement. But this movement was not occurring on the surface. It was entirely subterranean. The seismic signature originated at a depth that corresponded exactly to the roof of the impossible, cavernous void network the sonar had previously mapped beneath the eastern perimeter. Something immense was moving below the ground, and it was tracking in perfect, chilling synchronization with the invisible electromagnetic source that was walking above it on the surface. 2 distinct signatures, separated by hundreds of feet of solid earth and bedrock, were moving as one single entity. Then, at 2:23 a.m., the infrared cameras finally saw it. What materialized in that initial frame and the 47 continuous frames that followed over the next 6 minutes abruptly ended the morning review session. The footage was so profoundly disturbing, so completely beyond the pale of natural explanation, that it prompted the team's first immediate call outside their standard chain of command. A massive, amorphous thermal shape appeared on the screens, burning bright against the freezing background of the desert night. And just as deliberately as the entire event began, it ended. At exactly 2:29 a.m., absolutely everything ceased simultaneously. The stalking electromagnetic surge, the heavy engineered infrasound, the deep subterranean vibrations, and the massive thermal anomaly, all of it simply vanished in a single, silent frame. The infrared footage from that night leaves absolutely no room for debate or skeptical denial. Something was physically there. Military-grade thermal imaging does not invent ghosts. It does not hallucinate.
It renders objective heat signatures against a cold background with absolute, unforgiving clarity. The physics of thermal radiation do not negotiate with skeptics. Because the anomaly was captured simultaneously across multiple overlapping camera feeds, the possibility of a single lens artifact or a software glitch is entirely eliminated. Because it remained present, solid, and moving for 47 consecutive frames across 6 full minutes, the theory of a transient atmospheric distortion is completely impossible. Its movement was highly directional and intensely purposeful.
It was not the random, chaotic drift of wind-blown debris, nor did it possess the irregular, instinctive gait of any known animal. Whatever this massive entity was, it knew exactly where it was going. Its thermal dimensions defied the size profile of every single species native to the Uinta Basin. It was far too large to be a bear, a wolf, or a mountain lion, and its mode of locomotion matched no biological signature on Earth. But the true terror of the footage wasn't just its massive shape or its impossible biology. It was exactly what this entity did when it reached the boundary line. The entity did not just wander aimlessly into the camera's field of view. It deliberately approached the eastern perimeter fence and stopped. It held a precise, unvarying distance from the boundary line across all 47 frames. It did not drift closer. It did not back away. It did not display the restless, territorial pacing of a biological creature operating on pure animal instinct. For 6 uninterrupted minutes, it held its ground with a calculated, impossible stillness. It was not wandering the desert looking for prey. It was not fleeing a predator. It was observing. It was standing at the edge of the property, staring into the trap they had built for it. Yet the detail that truly brought the data review session to a grinding, terrified halt was not actually found within those 47 frames of visual manifestation. The most terrifying data point was hidden in the 3 frames immediately preceding the manifestation and the single frame immediately following its abrupt departure. Just before the massive entity appeared on the cameras, the ambient thermal environment of the eastern perimeter abruptly plummeted. The baseline background temperature of the soil, the air, and the brush dropped by a margin so severe and instantaneous that it demanded an explanation before the anomaly itself even became the focus of the analysis. It was a pre-arrival signature. The local environment was physically warping, pulling heat out of the air, altering itself in advance of whatever was about to step into it. And when the entity finally left, it did not simply fade away into the distance. It did not walk back out of frame. In a single fraction of a second frame, the massive thermal anomaly vanished, and the background temperature instantly snapped back to absolute baseline. There was no transitional period. There was no thermal decay curve, which is a fundamental law of thermodynamics. When a massive heat source leaves an area, the residual heat slowly dissipates over time. But here, there was zero dissipation. It was as if whatever produced this massive heat event completely understood it was being recorded and simply switched the physics of the local area off. That is not how temperature works. That is not how anything within the known established parameters of our physical reality operates. And every single physicist, engineer, and scientist in that control room knew it. The sheer impossibility of the footage was cemented by the unblinking corroboration of 4 entirely independent sensor systems, all triggering across one hyper-specific 6-minute window. The electromagnetic data told a story that began before the thermal cameras even saw the dark take shape. The invisible field strength peaked precisely in the exact physical location where the thermal anomaly would later appear, and it decreased in perfect inverse proportion to the distance as it moved.
When the technical team painstakingly triangulated that electromagnetic data and mapped it directly over the infrared footage, frame by grueling frame, the invisible source and the visible thermal mass overlapped perfectly. The technical report chillingly described this correlation as beyond coincidence. The structured, engineered infrasound arrived exactly 2 minutes before the visual manifestation began, and it ceased the very millisecond the visual anomaly vanished. And all the while, the brown vibration data conclusively confirmed that something immense was moving deep within the subterranean void network, tracking at the exact same pace, stopping at the exact same moment, and facing the exact same direction as the thermal shape on the surface. To dismiss this event as a natural glitch would require 4 entirely distinct, highly calibrated technologies to simultaneously generate a perfectly correlated, directionally consistent, and simultaneously terminating hallucination. The odds of that happening are statistically zero.
If it was not a coincidence, the implications for the future of anomalous research are absolutely staggering. It means that every major, heavily funded investigation program to ever set foot on the property has been tragically misguided from day one. NIDS, the Pentagon's covert AAWSAP initiative, and 5 years of cutting-edge broadcast television investigations were all built entirely on one foundational, fatal assumption. They all believed that the source of the phenomenon lived permanently inside the boundary. That single, flawed belief dictated every camera angle, every sensor placement, every deployed experiment, and every engineered blind spot. But that assumption was completely, fundamentally wrong. Skinwalker Ranch is not where the phenomenon originates. It is where the phenomenon arrives. These 47 frames of correlated infrared footage serve as the very first unclassified, mathematically proven documentation of that arrival in progress. This is not the residual aftermath of a paranormal event. This is not the fading echo of something that happened years ago. This is the intelligence itself, creeping silently along the boundary line, holding a highly calculated distance, dragging 4 impossible physical signatures along with it, before switching them all off in a single, mocking frame. The boundary surrounding Skinwalker Ranch is not merely a rancher's fence. It is not just a meaningless property line drawn on a county map. It is an active, humming threshold. It is a doorway that something waiting out there in the dark knows exactly how to use. The ranch is not the source. It is the destination. And for 3 decades, absolutely no one was watching the approach. But someone else already knew this. When the Pentagon's classified AAWSAP documents were partially forced into the light through Freedom of Information Act requests, they revealed a profoundly chilling detail that changes the entire context of this footage. Buried within the dense bureaucratic reports, they reference the exact section of the broader Uinta Basin from which this entity's approach vector undeniably originates. The reference is incredibly brief, but the surrounding context is swallowed whole by black redactions. These were not the standard blanket sweeps of black ink to hide mundane personnel names. They were surgical, precise, deeply considered cuts. Specific passages describing environmental findings, specific sensor deployments, and specific scientific conclusions were meticulously carved out of the public record. Someone deeply embedded within the defense intelligence structure reviewed those specific documents and made deliberate, calculated choices about what the American public would never be allowed to see. The only surviving text in that entire passage does not describe the basin in terms of native wildlife or natural geology. It uses the cold, sterile, uncompromising language of access restriction, special personnel clearance levels, and strict distribution limits. It is a classification marker applied not to the methods of data collection, but to the actual, terrifying discoveries. Someone within the military or government structure investigated that dark, barren stretch of the basin.
They sent people out there. They documented exactly what they found lurking in the rock formations. And then, those findings were heavily restricted to an unnamed, highly compartmented subset of program personnel, locked away from anyone who dared to look next. Until this massive perimeter array was deployed, the current investigation had never placed instruments in that specific section of the basin. The broadcast episodes never addressed it. No public research program ever systematically monitored it. This terrifying perimeter sweep footage is the absolute first undeniable evidence produced entirely outside the government's classified framework that mathematically connects that forgotten, heavily redacted stretch of the basin directly to the crushing intelligence operating daily on the ranch. The government knew exactly where the approach vector originated. They investigated the source long before Brandon Fugel ever signed the deed to the property. They buried what they found in the dark. But now, that buried, classified secret is exactly what the modern investigation is aiming its entire technological arsenal at. After 30 years of staring inward at the dirt, the team finally has a direction. The approach vector is definitively established. The massive underground signature moving beneath the eastern perimeter is fully documented. The corroborating, physically impossible data captured across 4 completely independent sensor systems is permanently logged in the digital archive. That restricted, heavily redacted section of the Uinta Basin is no longer sitting safely outside the frame. Dr. Travis Taylor has stated publicly, staking his massive scientific reputation on the claim that the void network mapped beneath the property is absolutely not a natural geological formation. Eric Bard's 5 years of unrelenting sensor data point directly to a terrifying, active symbiosis between the subsurface structures hidden in the bedrock and the aerial phenomena burning brightly in the sky above them. And now the perimeter footage adds a third, incredibly sinister layer to the mystery. Something is approaching from the outside, something that possesses the terrifying ability to move above the soil and beneath the solid bedrock simultaneously. Something that possessed the chilling, advanced awareness to know exactly when it was being watched, erasing all physical and thermal evidence of its own existence in a single, silent frame. What exactly is it? Where does it actually come from? And what terrifying truth did the government find at the far end of that approach vector that was so incredibly dangerous it had to be completely redacted from human history? Share this episode with someone who thinks they know the truth about Skinwalker Ranch, because the investigation just stepped outside the fence.